We arrived at the campsite just before dusk, a quiet stretch of forest miles from any town. The sort of place you only find when you're not really looking. The air was crisp, the trees tall and shadowed, and the fire we built crackled and spat as we huddled around it, telling the usual stories people tell when they're trying to forget the world outside. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just us and the silence of the woods. But we all knew the quiet has its own way of turning sinister, of creeping under your skin when you least expect it. The fire threw long, jagged shadows over our tents, flickering in the cold breeze that started to pick up. I remember how the wind began to whistle through the branches, an odd sound, like it wasn't quite the wind at all. But we didn't talk about it. We just ignored the way it clawed at our thoughts, shrugged it off like you do when you don't want to admit something feels wrong. Later that night, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping outside my tent. The kind of sound that makes you sit up straight, heart pounding against your ribs. I told myself it was one of the others, maybe just someone getting up to use the bathroom. But when I called out, no one answered. The night swallowed my voice, leaving me with nothing but the cold and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I wasn't ready to get out of the tent just yet. Not without knowing what was out there, so I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Just the wind. Just the trees. Morning came slower than it should have. The fire had burned down to nothing but embers, and there was a chill in the air that hadn't been there the night before. One by one, we emerged from our tents, rubbing sleep from our eyes. But something was wrong. Immediately, you could feel it. There was an absence, a gap where there shouldn't have been one. And then it hit us. One of us was gone. We called his name, searched the perimeter of the camp, our voices bouncing off the towering trees that surrounded us. But there was no answer. His tent was zipped open, sleeping bag tossed aside like he'd gotten up in a hurry. No sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away. He was just gone. We split into pairs, searching deeper into the woods. The shadows seemed longer now, darker, like they clung to the trunks of the trees a little too close. I walked with a knot in my stomach, feeling eyes on the back of my neck. Every so often I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A quick flicker, something darting between the trees. But when I turned, there was nothing. Hours passed, and the sun barely moved in the sky, stuck in that same dull gray haze. We were about to head back to camp when we saw them. A group of figures, moving slowly, stiffly, through the woods. At first, I thought they were other campers, but as we got closer, it became clear something was very, very wrong. Their faces, they weren't right. They had eyes, noses, mouths, sure, but there was no life in them, no expression. It was like looking at mannequins dressed in human skin, their heads swiveling toward us in perfect synchronization, as if they'd known we were there all along. Their clothes were old, tattered, hanging off their bodies like they'd been wearing them for years. And their movements, they weren't natural. They walked in a slow, dragging gait, heads tilting in an unnatural rhythm, limbs jerking like marionettes being tugged by invisible strings. We froze, rooted to the spot, watching them pass between the trees without a word, without a sound. It wasn't until they were out of sight that we could breathe again. But even then, the air felt thick, oppressive, like the forest had closed in around us. By the time we got back to camp, it was almost dark. There was no sign of our missing friend, no tracks, no clues, nothing. Just an eerie silence hanging in the air, heavier than before. We gathered around the fire, our nerves on edge, glancing over our shoulders at every snap and creak in the forest. We didn't talk much that night, just sat there staring into the flames. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from beyond the trees. Something patient, something waiting. And then, as the fire died down, I saw it. One of the figures from earlier, standing just beyond the glow of the embers, its face pale and blank, watching us. I tried to call out, tried to warn the others, but my throat locked up. My voice caught in a choke of terror. The figure stood there, motionless for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, it took a step forward, its body lurching toward the dying light. And that's when I knew we were never getting out of these woods. Not alive, anyway. Because whatever those things were, they weren't people. They weren't alive. And they sure as hell weren't going to let us leave. The fire sputtered and hissed as the last ember died out, plunging us into darkness. But I couldn't move. My eyes were fixed on the figure just outside the circle of where the light had been, a lifeless silhouette blending with the night. Its face, a mask of nothingness, hovered in the shadows, but I could feel it watching us. Not just me, all of us. I finally forced out a sound, more of a croak than a scream. and the others turned to look at me. My throat was dry, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Over there," I managed to whisper, but when I pointed, the figure was gone. Disappeared into the trees like it had never been there at all. "What the hell are you talking about?" one of the others said, frustration and fear creeping into his voice. "There's nothing there." I knew what I saw, but how could I explain it? Something that shouldn't exist. Something that made no sense. My mind reeled, spinning between disbelief and terror. The others muttered, shifting nervously, but we all felt it. Something was terribly wrong. The night felt heavier, darker, and it pressed in on us like a suffocating blanket. One of the guys grabbed a flashlight and swept it across the tree line. It cut through the thick night, but the beam only revealed more trees, more shadows. "We need to go back to town," he said. His voice was shaking now. "We need to get the hell out of here, screw the trip." The fear was real. It gnawed at each of us. But then came the sound, a low, dragging noise, like something being pulled through the underbrush, slow and deliberate. It came from the direction where the figure had stood, only now there was more than one sound, more than one dragging. The woods came alive with movement, faint but growing, circling us. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Everyone went quiet, listening. The dragging sounds grew louder, closer. It was like nails scratching against dirt, a sound that twisted in my gut and sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever was out there wasn't just wandering anymore, it was coming. "Grab your stuff, we need to move," someone said, barely able to keep the panic out of their voice. But no one argued. We all scrambled, stuffing gear into bags, the silence between us growing unbearable. There was no comfort in words now, only the primal instinct to get away. The dragging sound grew closer, and I could swear I heard breathing, ragged, wet breaths just beyond the trees. We were running out of time. We slung our packs over our shoulders and headed toward the trail that led back to the road. The flashlights danced over the trees, casting eerie, shifting shapes that made it hard to tell what was real. We moved quickly, fear spurring us forward, but the forest felt like it was closing in. The trees seemed taller, thicker, like they were crowding around us, blocking out what little light the moon offered. And then we saw them. The figures. Not just one this time, dozens of them, standing motionless in the path ahead, their blank faces staring straight at us. They were scattered through the trees, some closer than others, but all of them watching, waiting. "Oh my God," someone whispered, and we all froze. The cold air cut through us, making it hard to breathe. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, unnatural. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the forest and replaced with them, these silent watchers. I felt my skin crawl like ants marching up my spine. "Turn back," one of the others said, voice trembling. "We can't go through them." But where could we go? Behind us, the dragging sounds still echoed, growing louder, closer. The woods were alive with it now, a cacophony of unnatural movement. We were trapped, surrounded. Then, without warning, the figures began to move. Slowly at first, a jerky, unnatural shuffle, their heads lolling to one side as if their necks could barely hold them up. They moved as one, closing the distance between us, inching forward with that same dragging sound that had haunted us all night. The panic hit like a tidal wave. We turned and ran, bolting off the path deeper into the woods. The branches whipped at our faces, thorns tore at our clothes, but we didn't stop. The flashlights bobbed wildly, casting fleeting beams of light over twisted trees and roots waiting to trip us. I heard someone fall behind me, a curse, a grunt, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting away. We ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. Finally, we stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. The woods around us were deathly silent now, but the silence wasn't comforting. It was ominous. Like the calm before a storm. "They're gone," one of the others said, though none of us believed it. We all sat there trying to catch our breath, fear still coursing through our veins. But something was wrong. I looked around, scanning the group, and my heart dropped into my stomach. There were only 3 of us now. One of us was missing, again. "What the hell?" I muttered, scrambling to my feet, spinning in circles, searching the trees for any sign of him. "Where did he go? He was just here!" We called his name, but the only response was the wind whistling through the trees, cold and sharp, carrying with it that familiar dragging sound. And then from the darkness we heard it, a scream. It wasn't the scream of an animal or even something human. It was high-pitched, distorted, as if whatever was out there was mimicking a sound it had only heard before but didn't quite understand. And that's when I realized the figures, the wanderers, they were collecting us, one by one. We stood there, rooted to the ground in that clearing, the scream still echoing through the trees like it had seeped into the earth itself. Our missing friend, he was out there somewhere. But that sound, that unholy sound, it was like something alive had twisted his voice into something else, something unnatural. I swallowed hard, my throat raw from the cold air and fear. "We have to go after him." "Are you insane?" The reply came, sharp and terrified. "Did you hear that? He's gone. Just like the other one, we can't stay here. We have to keep moving." But how could we leave him? My gut churned with guilt and terror, but the truth hung in the air between us like a noose. Every time we stopped, every time we turned our backs, someone vanished. It was like the woods themselves were picking us off, feeding us to those things, the night wanderers. And yet standing there, doing nothing, waiting, it felt worse. We couldn't just let them take him. We couldn't. Without another word, I grabbed the flashlight and started walking toward the sound of the scream. My hands were trembling, sweat trickling down my spine despite the cold. The others hesitated, their breathing shallow and fast, but I heard them follow. What else could we do? Leaving someone behind felt like signing our own death warrants. The woods thickened as we moved deeper, the trees like twisted arms reaching out to pull us in. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy now, and the beams of our flashlights flickered as if the batteries were struggling to stay alive. Every step forward felt like pushing into a void, a place where time and reason no longer existed. And then we found it. The flashlight caught something on the ground and I froze. There, half covered in leaves and dirt, was his jacket. Torn, shredded like it had been pulled apart by something with claws. But there was no blood. No sign of a struggle. Just the jacket, lying there as if he had simply disappeared out of it. "What the hell?" one of the others whispered, his voice barely audible. I reached down to pick up the jacket, my hand shaking. As soon as my fingers brushed the fabric, the sound returned. That same dragging noise, closer now. But this time there was something else beneath it. Whispers. Faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakable. Words. Words that shouldn't exist. Words that made no sense, but crawled into your ears and dug deep into your brain. We stood there, frozen, listening. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions, circling us like predators. And then, just beyond the beam of my flashlight, something moved. It wasn't like before. This wasn't one of the wanderers slowly creeping toward us. This was something faster, something that darted between the trees with unnatural speed. I caught only glimpses. A flash of pale skin, a face twisted in agony, limbs that didn't bend the right way. "We need to move, now!" someone hissed, and I couldn't argue. We backed away, but every step felt slower, heavier, like the forest was fighting to keep us in place. The whispers grew louder, and the dragging sound was everywhere now, echoing through the trees. It was coming for us. I could feel it, that sickening pull in my gut, the sense that something was just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then we heard the footsteps. They didn't belong to us. Heavy, deliberate, they came from somewhere behind us, moving quickly, as if something or someone was running toward us. We turned, flashlights whipping around in the darkness, catching only trees and more trees. But the footsteps kept coming, growing louder, faster, until they were right on top of us. A figure burst from the trees, hurtling toward us. I barely had time to react before it crashed into me, knocking me to the ground. I scrambled to get my flashlight, aiming it toward the attacker, but when the light fell on him, my blood turned to ice. It was our friend, the one who disappeared earlier. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, like he was staring through us. His clothes were torn, his skin covered in dirt and something darker, something that looked like ash. But his hands, they were wrong. Twisted, gnarled like the bones had been bent backward, the fingers too long, the nails jagged and blackened. "Help me!" he croaked. But his voice, it wasn't his. It was that same distorted, high-pitched sound from before. Like whatever was speaking through him didn't quite know how to use words anymore. I stumbled back, horrified. He lunged forward again, his arms flailing wildly, his movements jerky and unnatural. I barely managed to get out of the way before he hit the ground, writhing and twitching like something was crawling under his skin. His mouth opened, but instead of a scream, all that came out was a gurgling, choking sound, as if he was drowning in his own voice. "We need to run!" someone shouted, and this time I didn't argue. We bolted, leaving him behind, his twisted form still convulsing on the ground. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step, and the dragging sound returned, closer than ever. It was like the forest itself was alive, reaching out for us with invisible hands. We ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, until the trees thinned out and we stumbled into another clearing. But as soon as we stopped, I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. There were 5 of us when we started running. Now there were only 2. Where? I stammered, spinning around, searching the edges of the clearing, but there was no sign of the others. No sound, no scream, nothing. They were just gone. And then, from the darkness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Tall, pale, its face still and blank like the others we'd seen before. But this one, it was wearing the jacket we'd found in the dirt. It took a step forward, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. "We have to go," the other person whispered, but I couldn't move. Because as the figure stepped closer, I realized something. The jacket it was wearing wasn't torn anymore. It was whole. The figure in the jacket took another step forward, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The clearing suddenly felt too small, the air too thick, like the very world around us was closing in. My flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering in and out, casting jagged shadows over the figure's face. Its features were still too smooth, too perfect, as if someone had molded it out of wax and forgotten to give it life. But that jacket, it was whole, untouched. The same jacket our friend had been wearing before he disappeared, before we'd found it torn and discarded in the dirt. And now it was pristine, wrapped around this thing. Beside me, the other person, I could hear their breathing, shallow, fast. They were just as terrified as I was, but we were frozen, paralyzed by the sight of this impossible figure moving toward us. Step by slow, deliberate step, the wind picked up again, colder this time, biting at our skin, and with it came the whispers. Those terrible, sickening whispers, crawling through the trees like a living thing, wrapping around us, filling our heads with nonsense, with words we couldn't understand but felt deep in our bones. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but I couldn't. My legs refused to move, as if some unseen force had taken control of them, rooting me to the ground. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light, its head tilting to the other side now, its blank eyes staring straight through me. And then it spoke. "Help me!" The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, broken, like someone had taken pieces of speech and stitched them together in the wrong order. It was the same voice our friend had used before he collapsed, but this time it was worse. This time it was coming from something that shouldn't be alive. Without warning, the figure lunged forward, its arms outstretched, fingers twisted and gnarled like tree roots. The flashlight slipped from my hand as I stumbled back, falling hard to the ground, my heart pounding so fast I thought it might burst. The light spun wildly, casting erratic beams through the clearing, illuminating flashes of the figure's face, its smooth, featureless face, coming closer and closer. And then, the light hit something else. Another figure, and another. They stood at the edge of the clearing, silent and still, watching. All of them wearing the faces of the friends who had disappeared. But their faces weren't right. They were empty, like masks, their features smoothed over as if someone had erased every expression, every sign of life. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, but the whispers were so loud now, so deafening. I could barely hear my own thoughts over the noise. The figures were closing in, moving in that same jerky, unnatural way, their limbs bending at wrong angles, their heads twitching from side to side. And then, just when I thought they would grab me, just when I thought it was over, they stopped. All of them. They froze in place, their heads cocked to the side as if listening for something. The silence that followed was so abrupt, so complete, it was suffocating. The wind had died. The whispers had vanished. There was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, ragged and terrified. I glanced around, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. But then I realized something that chilled me to my core. The other person, they were gone. In the panic, I hadn't even noticed. They were standing right next to me a moment ago, but now, nothing. No sound, no scream, no struggle. Just gone. Like the others. I was alone. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the figures moved again, blocking every direction. No matter where I looked, they were there. Their blank, lifeless faces staring at me, their bodies twitching like broken marionettes. And then one of them stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. It was wearing the same jacket, The same pristine jacket, and as it got closer, I saw it wasn't just the jacket that was whole. The face was familiar, too familiar. It was our friend, or at least it looked like him now. The features were back, his eyes, his nose, his mouth, all of it. But there was something wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, there was nothing behind them. Just an empty, soulless stare. He smiled. But it wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque imitation of one, stretched too wide, too unnatural. "Come with us," he whispered, the voice broken, distorted, that same unnatural mimicry of human speech. "It's better. In the dark." I stumbled back, shaking my head, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, anything. But I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, in the distance, I heard it again. That dragging sound. It was coming back, louder this time, closer. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble with each pull, like something massive was dragging itself through the forest toward the clearing. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, waiting. The dragging sound grew louder, and I turned, my flashlight flickering on the edge of the clearing. And then I saw it. Something in the darkness. Something massive, hulking, crawling on all fours. Its body was twisted, contorted in ways that didn't make sense. Its skin stretched tight over bones that jutted out at impossible angles. Its face was a hideous parody of the figures, blank, featureless, but larger. Much larger. It dragged itself closer, leaving a trail of black, oozing slime in its wake. The sound of its movement sending a sickening chill through my spine. And then it stopped. Right at the edge of the clearing. The figures turned toward it, as if acknowledging its presence. And then, without warning, they all moved at once, surging forward in a blur of motion, grabbing at me, their hands cold and stiff like dead wood. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was the hulking figure crawling toward me, its face inches from mine, its breath cold and rancid. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the darkness was thick, suffocating like a damp blanket pressed against my face. I couldn't tell if I was alive or dead, awake or dreaming. My body felt numb, and for a moment I thought I was buried. Buried beneath the weight of the forest, beneath the earth itself. Then slowly my senses returned. The ground beneath me was cold and hard, the air heavy with the smell of decay. I could hear something, faint, distant. A slow rhythmic scraping, like something sharp dragging across stone. The sound sent a chill through my bones, and the realization hit me. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle aching as if I'd been lying there for hours, maybe longer. The forest was gone. I was somewhere else now. A room, no, not a room, a cavern. The walls were jagged and rough, slick with something dark and glistening in the faint light that seemed to ooze from the cracks in the stone. I could barely make out the shapes around me, but the space felt vast, endless, like the belly of some monstrous creature. And then I saw them, the figures. They were standing in the shadows, just out of reach, their blank faces staring at me with the same lifeless gaze. But they weren't still this time. They were swaying, rocking back and forth in unison, their heads tilting at odd angles. And there were more of them now, dozens, maybe hundreds, all of them watching me, waiting. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out, sending me crashing back to the ground. Panic surged through me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. What had happened? Where was I? And then I remembered, the hulking figure, the dragging sound, the cold grip of those hands pulling me into the darkness. I wasn't supposed to be alive. I wasn't supposed to be here. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't coming from the figures. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my gut, and that's when I saw it. The creature from the woods, the massive hulking thing that had dragged itself toward me, was here, crawling through the shadows. Its body was even more grotesque than I remembered, its limbs long and twisted, bones jutting out at impossible angles. Its face, if you could call it that, was a smooth, featureless mask of flesh, but this close, I could see it shifting, pulsing, as if something beneath the skin was trying to break free. The creature moved with that same slow, deliberate dragging, its long, clawed fingers scraping against the stone floor, leaving deep gouges in its wake. But it wasn't coming for me. It was headed toward the figures. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. As the creature passed the figures, one by one, they began to change. Their blank faces rippled, twisted, and morphed until they weren't blank anymore. They became us. The friends I had lost. The ones who had vanished into the woods. Their faces stared back at me, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths twisted into silent screams. "No, no, no!" I whispered, crawling backward, my body trembling with horror. The creature continued its slow advance, and with each figure it passed, another face appeared. Another friend. Another victim. But the worst part, the part that made my skin crawl, that made my heart stop in my chest, was that they were all still alive. Trapped. I could see it in their eyes. They were trapped in those bodies, prisoners of whatever horror had taken them. I tried to scream, to call out to them, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the thick, oppressive air. The creature stopped suddenly, its head snapping in my direction, as if it had finally noticed me. The cavern went silent, the only sound the slow, wet dripping of whatever oozed from the walls. I could feel its gaze on me even though it had no eyes. It was looking at me, waiting, calculating. And then it spoke. "You should not have come." The voice wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, like the grinding of stone. It vibrated through the walls, through my bones, making my teeth ache. "You belong to me now," it rasped, "like the others." My heart pounded so loud I thought it might burst from my chest. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking, and stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The cavern stretched on endlessly, the walls twisting and shifting in the dim light. The creature began to move again, dragging itself toward me, slow and methodical, as if it had all the time in the world. Its claws scraped against the stone, sending sparks flying in the darkness. And then from behind it I saw something moving. It was one of the figures. No, not just one. All of them. They were moving in unison now, stepping out of the shadows, their faces still twisted into those grotesque imitations of life. But there was something different about them now. Something new. They were smiling. Wide, unnatural smiles that stretched their faces to the breaking point, their teeth gleaming in the dim light. And as they moved, they began to hum, a low, haunting tune that echoed through the cavern, vibrating in my skull. The creature stopped, its head twitching toward them as if confused. And that's when I realized they weren't following it anymore. They were coming for me. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the slick stone, my heart pounding in my chest. The humming grew louder, the smiles wider, their faces stretched beyond recognition. I could feel their presence behind me, closing in, their cold, dead hands reaching out for me. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried to escape, the cavern seemed to stretch on forever. The walls twisted, warped, the floor sloped and curved, and I realized with a sickening dread that I wasn't running in circles. I was running in place. And then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, the humming stopped. I looked around, breathless, my legs trembling. The figures were gone. The cavern was silent. But something was wrong. I could feel it deep in my bones. The air was too still, too quiet. And then I heard the dragging sound again. I turned slowly, my stomach twisting in knots. The creature was right behind me, its massive form towering over me, its face inches from mine. Its mouth opened, wide and black, and from the darkness inside I saw something move. A hand. A human hand reaching out from within the creature's mouth. And then I heard the voice. "My turn," it whispered, in the voice of my missing friend. Before I could scream, the hand grabbed me, pulling me into the darkness, into the cold, endless void where they all waited. The night wanderers. And I knew, as the last of the light vanished from my sight, that I had become one of them.